Thank you all for coming today to our 14th year of the Student Scholar Series. I had planned to do this in a more professional venue, but as I was telling Kelly and Mike, my Mac has frozen on me. I'm now doing it with in my office, so with football posters behind me. So this is, but I am nevertheless, I am honored to be hosting this today. Our 14th year, as I said, Student Scholar Series presentation, the first of this year. It was instituted, the series that is, 14 years ago in order to recognize notable legal scholarship produced by members of the student body during the previous academic year, and to foster the skills associated with presenting and defending that scholarship in a professional conference style setting. Today's presentation will be made by third-year law student Kelly Laughlin. If you haven't been to one of these before, this is the format. I will do the introductions here in just a moment. Then Kelly will make her presentation for 20 minutes, and then Michael Lazarus, a respondent whom I'm about to introduce, will conduct a response for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A session. If you would all stay on mute while Kelly and Michael are doing their presentations, and on mute throughout until you're called upon. Just raise your hand, then in order we'll ask the questions. So that's how we'll proceed. Before I introduce Kelly, a few words about the respondent, Michael Lazarus. He is one of the founding members of Telecommunications Law Professionals, currently is the managing member of the firm. He advises domestic and international clients in the telecommunications industry on transactional and regulatory matters before the Federal Communications Commission and state and local regulatory bodies. He handles a wide range of legal matters for telecommunication companies, including general counseling on federal regulatory issues, regulatory policy advocacy at the FCC and on Capitol Hill, spectrum auction advice, communications-related litigation before the FCC, federal courts, and state public utility commissions, international telecommunications ventures, and a wide range of other transactions, including mergers and acquisitions, equipment contracts, debt and equity placements, intercarrier arrangements, and interconnection agreements. He's often interviewed about his views on the telecommunications industry and has been quoted extensively in Law 360, Communications Daily, and other notable telecommunication news outlets. So as you can see, eminently qualified to be our respondent today. It's an honor to have him. Thank you, Mike, for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Now to introduce our student scholar, Kelly Laughlin. She is a third-year law student here at the Catholic University of America Columbus School of Law and has a Bachelor of Arts in Foreign Affairs and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Virginia. She has a passion for telecommunications regulation and research in rural and broadband expansion in the U.S. Kelly has interned at Telecommunications Law Professionals, PLLC, the Federal Communications Commission, and Wiley Ryan LLP. Before law school, she was a content manager of legal and regulatory affairs at Gerson Lerman Group, and she specialized in telecommunications and technology policy. Kelly's interest in this topic started prior to law school. Rural broadband expansion had been at the center of the FCC policy agenda during the previous administration, and she had worked on consulting projects on the Sprint T-Mobile merger. She started to see a connection between telecommunications network build-out and large mergers in this sector. While she acknowledges how difficult rural broadband build-out is in her work, she also wants to show how the FCC has failed to create a strong incentive structure to support their policy goals. I'll now turn the floor over to the first of this year's student scholars, Kelly Laughlin. The title of her presentation, Rural Broadband Build-Out, How the Federal Communications Commission Anti-Competitive Practices Collided in the 5G Fund Proceeding. Kelly.
Thanks so much, Professor Harmon. I really appreciate it. I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Great. So as Professor Harmon mentioned, we'll focus on rural broadband build-out today. And I'm Kelly Laughlin, as he stated as well. To start, my overall thesis is that the Federal Communications Commission, the agency responsible for regulating the telecom sector in the US, really one of the agencies of a few that's responsible, they've entrusted private companies to build communications networks in rural areas without the proper incentive structure in place to ensure that rural customers actually receive broadband access. And what you're probably thinking to yourself is that that maybe doesn't sound like English to you at this moment. So by the end of the presentation, I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand this sentence before us now. So we'll start with a little bit of background on the communications sector and then get into specifically the Universal Service Program and the large telecommunications mergers that intersect with that area. So starting with a little bit of background on the sector, when we're discussing broadband, we're really discussing high-speed internet. The FCC defines broadband as high-speed internet access that is always on and is faster than traditional dial-up access. There are currently 42 million Americans without broadband access. So this number it comfortably exceeds the population of California, our most populous state, and it amounts to about 1/8 of Americans. So for those 1/8 of Americans without broadband access, it might be because they simply don't have access or they cannot afford it. But I want to emphasize that today's talk will really focus on the accessibility issue rather than the affordability issue, which are sort of two separate concepts in this area. There has been a study from an organization called Broadband Now that has been widely cited and discussed in this area. And the study found that the FCC had been underestimating the number of people without broadband access by about 20 million, and that the underreporting was most pronounced in rural communities. So that study shows both the issues with rural broadband access and how difficult that's been for the US and the difficulties with mapping and knowing exactly how many people are without broadband access, which is a very difficult task. And this study sort of highlights that. It's really not financially viable to build networks in many areas in the US, including rural areas. So therefore, government funding has been necessary so that it makes more financial sense for companies to build in these difficult to reach areas. Without broadband access, customers are not able to participate in the global economy as it exists today, especially as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So much has moved online, and without broadband access, many people are not able to use video services, which prevents them from participating in school, telehealth benefits, and other general areas that the global economy focuses on today. And this was a problem before the pandemic, and it was then exacerbated and grew as the pandemic moved so many people online. And in March of 2020, there were a lot of news stories about people being forced to sit in parking lots outside libraries to access hotspots so that they could go to school or go to work. And that was really brought on by exactly what we're talking about today, areas that lack broadband accessibility. Building in rural areas is very difficult. And one thing I want to emphasize that whether it's wireless technology or wireline technology, which are two different ways to have communications service, both of those require physical infrastructure. So even your mobile phone that operates off of spectrum, that still requires physical infrastructure that must be built. And building cell phone towers, wired connections, and fiber, so that encompasses both wireline and wireless technology. Building all of that in rural areas is challenging and costly, which is why the government has had to step in and provide government subsidies over time. Build out is even more difficult in remote areas and mountainous areas as well. And when I'm talking about building in rural areas, I also want to emphasize that we're just talking about the basic bare minimum of speed needed to conduct a video call or access streaming. And that does not always require 5G service. Sometimes 4G speeds can still allow that type of connection. And so while a lot of Americans who are not focused on this area know about 5G and its importance and have heard about it in advertising by the large companies and know that it's something we should be paying attention to, really the focus of this talk is that some of those speeds that have been advertised by these companies and the focus on 5G isn't necessarily what should be the focus for a lot of Americans in bridging that gap of the 42 million who are uncovered. And for many of us on this call, we complain about how much our internet costs. We think it's too expensive, but most of us have a choice between 2 high-speed broadband providers and the 3 carriers, but those choices simply aren't available to every American. And that's what we want to keep in mind as we're moving through the rest of this presentation. I also want to mention that we're not just talking about connections in rural areas on computers, and it's important to keep in mind that a lot of Americans can only access the internet through their smartphones rather than a computer. So what I found as I've been learning more about telecom in my internships and different experiences throughout law school, one thing that I noticed that was missing from sort of these discussions on rural broadband expansion is that the FCC funds programs to incentivize companies to build networks in rural areas, and that's discussed a lot. But what's missing is that the FCC is also approving large telecommunications mergers alongside rural broadband conditions that aren't being discussed as much and aren't being discussed alongside some of these different universal service programs, which I'll go through in a moment. And I wanted to make that connection when I wrote my paper, and that's really what we'll focus on today. So we've gone through a little bit of a background on the telecom sector, and we'll address universal service, which makes it financially viable for companies to build in difficult to reach or rural areas. Then we'll address the mergers that I mentioned and some of the enforcement mechanisms that are available to the commission and to the agency that's regulating all of this, and then we'll move into our Q&A. So starting with the Universal Service Program, as the name sort of reflects, the government has determined that telecommunications is a utility and should be available to all Americans. So the Universal Service Program seeks to make that goal possible. The FCC requires that communications companies contribute a portion of their interstate revenues to the Universal Service Fund. And in this way, customers in urban areas are essentially subsidizing service in rural areas. And the subsidies for residential phone service that originally helped rural Americans were redirected to different funds that were created within the umbrella of the Universal Service Program. Those were called the Connect America Fund and the Mobility Fund. And those funds focused on increasing access to modern mobile broadband technology rather than the traditional wired connections. And this is important because, as I mentioned before, many Americans are only accessing the internet through their smartphones. So increasing access to this mobile broadband technology was really important to increase broadband access for a lot of Americans. And that sort of created the Universal Service programs that we see today. The 5G Fund is a universal service program that was started under the previous administration's FCC. So the Connect America Fund that I mentioned before had this very large budget over 5 years, so about $20 billion over 5 years that funded broadband deployment on rural areas. And as technology evolved, that was changed into the Mobility Fund, which focused on 4G LTE build out. And there were some other programs within the Universal Service umbrella, such as the Alaska Plan, that also focused on 4G technology, as the name suggests, in Alaska. So these funds developed as the technology changed so that the commission was providing subsidies and funding for these companies to build the newest technology in these areas. And under the former FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, he was really focused both on rural broadband. He's from Kansas, and he talks about how he talked about when he was chairman, how rural broadband impacted the community he grew up in. It was something that he discussed a lot. And he was also very focused on expanding 5G. So that increased sort of the average person's awareness of that 5G was happening and being expanded. So he led, as part of those 2 initiatives, he led the 5G Fund initiative, which is $9 billion in support for rural areas to build 5G technology over a 10-year period. But as these universal service programs were being developed and being and moving forward to the point that they are today, there's been criticism that these billions of dollars have been spent on rural broadband access, but we really haven't closed that gap. There's still these tens of millions of Americans who don't have access. And On top of that, one thing that really came to a head in the 5G fund proceeding was that the data accuracy that I've mentioned before of really not knowing who's covered and how much coverage exists and which areas specifically are covered. Those pieces of data just haven't been as accurate as people would want them to be, which led to the FCC underestimating the number of people that were covered. So these concerns with data accuracy really came to a head in the 5G fund, and both industry stakeholders and the FCC agreed to delay the 5G fund auction until we could have more accurate broadband maps. And that's also a large portion of the infrastructure bill under the current administration will give funding to create more accurate maps so that when the government is dispersing funds, it can be more efficient and make sure that we're giving funding to areas that really need it and don't have coverage. And another item that I want to emphasize from the 5G fund too that is interesting and we can discuss more in Q&A is it requires these 5G speeds, which can be up to 100 times faster than 4G. And there is an open question on whether every American really needs the highest and best speeds that are associated with 5G, or if these 4G speeds that still enable some of the video calling we have today, if that can be enough for some people. And the current trajectory of where the commission is going suggests more of a focus on 5G than maybe is wise. So overall, my main takeaway that I want you to have on universal service is basically that these programs finance one provider per geographic area. And the idea is that it would be inefficient to fund two providers to provide broadband access in the same area just to institute a false sense of competition. And the commission and industry stakeholders have all sort of agreed that that's the right approach. And the commission has stated it can promote some competition at the auction stage where providers are bidding on this universal service funding and require lower pricing for consumers in rural areas and force the consumer, not force the consumer, but require the provider to charge rates comparable to what urban customers have. But as I will discuss later as well, if a sole provider, if this one provider fails to meet its performance benchmarks in the universal service context, the commission faces somewhat limited options for enforcement action, and that can be very difficult for that one provider and the people that are supposed to be covered by them if that provider does fail to meet their universal service requirements. Now that we've discussed universal service, we'll focus on some of the mergers that I've referred to earlier on. This new focus on 5G in the previous administration did influence the FCC's decision to approve the Sprint T-Mobile merger. So we've gone from 4 carriers in the US to 3, which was a large, it was a big deal. And so to convince the commission that they should be able to merge, a lot of the discussion centered on 5G and how the companies would be able to provide a faster rollout of the technology, therefore really benefiting the American economy and the American consumer. And as it works with some of these companies, and this has happened in the past too, the companies will bring conditions to the commission that they'd like to see, that they're volunteering to commit, but it's in order to convince the commission to approve their merger. So as has happened in the past, Sprint and T-Mobile made voluntary commitments for rural broadband expansion in order to have the merger approved by the FCC. There are specific commitments that T-Mobile Sprint made in order to get the merger approved was to bring 85% of Americans 5G coverage within 3 years and 97% of all Americans within 3 years. And within 6 years, T-Mobile promised to bring 5G service to 90% of Americans in rural areas and 99% of all Americans. So those commitments are pretty extensive compared to what has been seen in the past. Those are pretty high percentages based on where we are now. And this is really different from what has happened in the past. So the commission has been advancing its rural broadband goals through its approach to approving large transactions for many years, Comcast and NBC promised to provide a service for lower income households where they could have broadband access for $10 a month, and they promised to provide that to 2.5 million low income households. By August 2019, that program, now called the Internet Essentials Program, provides internet to 8 million low income households, and it made its Wi-Fi hotspots free during the COVID pandemic too. So Comcast and NBC sort of went above and beyond their original commitments, but those commitments were also much smaller than the Sprint T-Mobile commitments that I showed on my last slide, which are really, really high, going up to 90% of rural Americans. That's much more than a 2.5 million household requirement. The AT&T DirecTV merger is also another interesting example, because that merger was not focused on rural broadband expansion or service expansion like the Sprint T-Mobile one was. It was really focused on making AT&T a paid TV powerhouse. It was more of a media merger, but the companies still use the commission's interest in rural broadband expansion in order to get approval for the transaction. The commission estimated that when they looked back on the merger, that only about 4.5 million households within AT&T's rural coverage commitments were covered. So that was far fewer than the 13 million households they promised. And one of the reasons for that discrepancy was because the definition of the commission's definition of rural and the AT&T's definition of rural had diverged. And so that was part of the reason for that difference. But in this way, you can see that there's been a couple different mergers that have used the commission's interest in rural broadband in order to get that merger approved, even when the merger is not related to expansion of service. And I started to notice the connection between universal service and these mergers when the 5G fund proceeding came out last year. So after its merger was completed, T-Mobile wanted to then participate in the 5G fund auctions and receive government funding through those programs. This was a large contention at the commission, and T-Mobile filed different comments with the FCC, as did other providers, arguing back and forth. And ultimately, the commission decided to allow T-Mobile to participate in the 5G fund auction, but it prohibited the company from counting any of the covered people for purposes of its merger-based commitments. So basically what this means is that if T-Mobile wins government subsidies through the 5G fund auction, it cannot count those people in that state towards its 85% or 90% benchmarks. But as I'll explain in a moment, that doesn't really prevent that doesn't really help T-Mobile, force T-Mobile to follow through on some of its merger commitments. So as universal service programs are rolled out and these mergers are approved, there are enforcement mechanisms in place from the regulator, the FCC, to make sure that those requirements and those commitments are followed. In the universal service context, this has been quite difficult because of the historical problems with inaccurate data that I've mentioned. And this led to the FCC and the industry stakeholders deciding to delay the 5G fund auction until more accurate maps can be developed. And additionally, in the universal service context, as I've mentioned a little bit, the speed of these new technologies is sort of outpacing some of these government programs, which are a lot of times benched in 5 or 10-year increments, as we saw with the Connect America Fund. And that's why so many of these funds are then shifted into newer technologies, as was done with the 5G fund. But it sort of leaves behind these 4G commitments, and some of these predecessor technologies could be really game-changing for a lot of Americans. But when the commission switches focus to 5G without making sure that all of the 4G commitments are fulfilled, that leaves a lot of people without service and broadband access. And in terms of enforcing T-Mobile's really extensive commitments, once T-Mobile meets the 50% coverage mark, the risk for the company to face a really damaging penalty of $500 million or more basically disappears. So what this means is that there's no true incentive for T-Mobile to build in the hardest to reach areas. So T-Mobile could face fines amounting to tens of thousands of dollars for achieving 85% coverage instead of 90% coverage. But those tens of thousands of dollars might be much cheaper than actually building the networks in the hardest to reach areas. And so in this way, T-Mobile is not really incentivized to build in the most difficult areas, which is sort of the point of some of these rural broadband conditions. Instead, it might just be cheaper for the company to pay the fine and better at the end of the day for their shareholders. If it's less money for them to just pay the fine, they might choose to do that. And that's really the main problem I see with the T-Mobile commitments in that way. So overall, what I'd like for you to take away from today's presentation is that the commission has given a lot of responsibility to private companies because one provider per geographic area provides rural broadband service and receives those government subsidies to build, but it also approves large transactions with really extensive rural commitments as well, further giving trust to these private companies. And despite the steps to develop more accurate broadband maps and create stronger enforcement mechanisms, a lot of people saw the T-Mobile financial penalties as much more specific and direct than some of the previous enforcement mechanisms had been. But overall, these efforts still don't create a strong enough incentive structure to bring service to the hardest to reach areas in rural America. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll pass it back over to Professor Harmon before we get into the Q&A.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot more about this than I had ever known. Very clear, cogent presentation. I'll turn things over now to Mike Lazarus, if you'll conduct the response with Kelly, and after that we will have the Q&A session. Mike.
Sure. Well, Kelly, great job. So what's the answer here? What should the commission be doing to further incentivize these for-profit entities to build out in areas where they normally wouldn't, just based on pure economics?
So one theoretical point I want to bring up is that basically end users, so Google, Facebook, different technology companies have basically built their businesses on the backs of these networks. And the networks are not compensated by Facebook, Uber, Google, some of these different companies. And one of the justifications for 5G build out is that we didn't know that 4G LTE technology would enable location services to the degree that it did. And that's what enabled Uber and food delivery and all of these different companies that grew the economy. And so one idea is that those end users and technology companies could cost share with the companies that are building the networks to make sure that they can build in all of these areas. However, that type of cost sharing would be extremely unprecedented and it's not likely to happen. I just think it's an interesting theoretical point in terms of what should actually is more actionable and more likely to happen from a policy perspective. I think the infrastructure bill is moving in the right direction by allocating more funding to developing more accurate broadband maps. I think that's a really important piece of getting this right and making sure that the hardest to reach areas are covered. And I also think, as I alluded to in my presentation, that not abandoning some of these 4G commitments is really important as well, so that because 4G enabled speeds could still facilitate video calling and some of these other things that are really important for people to connect to the global economy. And we're seeing some of those commitments be left behind in the current policy approach.
I mean, the idea of having a Facebook contribute to the ongoing maintenance or construction of networks is interesting. It sort of bumps into the idea of net neutrality, which is a term that I think folks sort of who don't do this regularly sort of know, the idea of anybody should be able to access a broadband network. As we know, telecom is a utility right now, phone service is a utility, but broadband service at the moment is not. Should it be a utility? Should we be regulating broadband service? Is it important enough to be classified as a utility at this point?
I think it's certainly important enough to be classified as a utility, and there's a lot of interesting arguments for why it's so critical to an everyday person's life, similar to how how telecom has been considered in the past. However, the only problem with regulating it as a utility is that the incentive to maintain and improve networks sort of goes away if it's not done in the private sector. And as a person, I think most people want the companies to develop and continue to maintain their networks and there's no financial incentive to do that otherwise. So
there's a thread sort of running through your entire presentation, this idea of sort of improving competition versus rural build out. So you brought out 3 different mergers, each of which resulted in at least some anti-competitive effects. And I think in each transaction, the companies trying to merge would come up with these sort of counterbalances. Okay, yeah, it's going to be a little more anti-competitive, but look over here, we're going to be building some broadband back here. Look at the shiny objects we're putting out there. How do you reconcile the two, or how should the FCC or NTIA, which is about to distribute, $42 billion, how do you reconcile the sort of anti-competitive versus public interest benefits aspect of these transactions?
So one of the ideas that I've seen written about that I think is interesting is to make sure that the conditions are related to the actual mergers. So the AT&T DirecTV merger that I brought up, that wasn't really about making sure that rural broadband access was expanded for Americans. It was really a media merger. And so the conditions that the companies brought to the FCC were very unrelated to that. And it sort of suggests that companies are taking advantage of the commission's interest in this area to get mergers approved that aren't really related to that. So I think having conditions that are actually related to the mergers, anti-competitive effects would be one way to do that. And making sure that the enforcement mechanisms are stronger, that if a company doesn't want to build in that area, that the fine outweighs the cost of building in that area, as I mentioned at the end.
So sort of going further on this anti-competitive point, if the goal of universal service is to build out, even if it's just one carrier, how should we view the pricing of that one carrier, right? So you're sort of, it's almost a monopoly into that home, right? If there's one broadband provider offering the best speed, should we be regulating their prices in some fashion? How do we make sure that their service actually gets to the consumers that we're worried about?
When there's just one provider in the area. So the commission, from my understanding, has already done that by requiring that the one provider per geographic area provides speeds comparable to provides prices comparable to what urban customers are paying in the rural areas. So that's already sort of being completed, and the infrastructure bill requires the same thing in these new areas that will be built, that they pay a price that's affordable. But what the government determines that is probably an open question, and that will be very important to limit the anti-competitive effects.
And should we just sort of figure, okay, they're getting service, folks in rural areas, should we just care a little bit less about competition, or should we be trying to promote more than one competitor in a particular market?
I think this is where the more accurate mapping comes in as well, because if there's areas that are truly so difficult to build in that it doesn't make sense to have more than one provider, those areas might be stuck with one provider and forced to rely on the commission regulating prices. But in the areas that are a little bit easier to build in and possibly less financially difficult for those companies, then I do think it's good to have two providers. However, we've also seen in urban areas that essentially that customers who have two choices, both choices end up still being rather expensive. It's just very expensive to build these networks, and there has to be sort of an incentive for companies to build and maintain their networks.
You alluded to this a few times in your presentation, the idea that Congress just passed an infrastructure bill where there's going to be 40 plus $42.5 billion that's going to be distributed. But this is by NTIA, not the FCC, which has been distributing universal service. How should NTIA be looking at this bucket of money to distribute, to do it in the most effective fashion?
So part of their money, as I mentioned, is going to go towards more accurate mapping, and that will be different from what the commission has done in the past. And they could also look at one of the problems I see with the infrastructure bill is that it does still require these 5G speeds, 100 up, 25 down, which is very, very fast. And so the NTIA could sort of differ from the commission's approach and say that the funding could be used to build 4G service. So it could have speeds that are lower than these 5G speeds that are very, very fast and might not really be necessary for every American. But that's not how the infrastructure bill is written. And I think that's probably a problem that they'll run into too, similar to the FCC, that not every American needs speeds that fast, and lower speeds would still be very, very dramatically helpful for some of these communities, but that's not how the bill is set up.
I mean, I can make an argument that 5G right now is more of a marketing term than something that's really going to benefit a consumer at this point, particularly the early on flavors of 5G, where you had all the wireless carriers sort of rushing to get a little 5G marker on your phone to say, hey, we're deploying 5G service. Well, is the speed any different? Well, it's 5G, don't worry about it. Just pay us an extra $10 a month. How does a consumer figure out if they actually need, how do we let a consumer figure out what service they actually need at this point?
So yes, so I think it is a marketing tool. And as we've discussed, basically what 5G would allow you to do is stream very large movies on 3 different screens. Like, just unless someone's watching 4K TV on 3 different TVs at the same time, they don't really need that sort of speed. And so, yes, it is a marketing tool. But the flip side of some of those arguments is that we don't need it today, because some of the speeds we already have are enough to facilitate our current technology. The counter argument that a lot of people have discussed about 5G is that we don't know what sort of technology it will facilitate. So in theory, it could facilitate really high speed and great quality VR experiences. And when 4G technology came out, like I mentioned in the presentation, that enabled all of these other different companies to start, like Uber and food delivery, because all of a sudden location was so much more available than it had been before because of the higher speeds. So the counter argument to all of this is that 5G really could facilitate all of these new things, but we just don't really know what those are going to be yet. And I would argue that the time that it will take to get to that place where you're really missing out, if you don't have 5G speeds, we're not quite there yet. So we should instead focus on facilitating access that can enable people in really difficult to reach areas to video call into school or to their doctor.
Great job, Kelly.
We'll now open the floor to questions. Before I do, I just wanted to say that Kelly's work was nominated by the Journal of Law and Technology, of which she is a member, and we thank them for doing that, because I certainly learned a lot today. I thank you, Kelly and Mike, for this great presentation. Questions from anyone, and I'll just have them asked in the order that you raise your hand. I will take the prerogative and ask one first. And I'm a real innocent in this, so this may be a dumb question, but is it cheaper is it physical, putting money into these things to build these things out there? You said there's a lot of physical stuff that has to be done to put this, so you got to have in remote areas and all. Is it cheaper to do things 5G and down lower, so that the commitments that are made, the over promising that is made, and you may say cynically that they are not really over promising, they're just doing this to get to get the money. But if all things were equal and everybody was not cynical and they were truly just over promising, is it cheaper to build at that lower level and considerably so? And would that get it done better?
Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the network components for 4G are more established and not as new, and so they are cheaper. And there's more providers that can do that, whereas 5G network components, it's a newer technology and there's a fewer number of providers that can provide that equipment.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Now the cost of all that type of stuff will come down in the future. I think the bigger problem is the cost to do these types of things in rural areas is always more expensive than doing it in an urban area, right? It's a lot easier to put up, small cells in an urban area than a rural area. It's easier. And look, it's hard to avoid the economics of this. Even if it's not cheaper, you're getting more service, you're getting more customers in that urban area as opposed to when you build out in rural. I think part of the reason we have the problem we have right now is because there's just no business case. The reason 40 million Americans don't have broadband is there's not a business case to get broadband to them. That's why, and it's also a very political, easy political thing to say right now. Well, who doesn't want to help broadband in the entire country? That's why we keep sort of throwing billions and billions of dollars at the problem. But while we're throwing all this money at it, we still haven't fixed it. And I'm going to sit here and say, even with this extra $40 billion we're going to put out there, we're not going to fix it anytime soon because of the difficulties of doing this type of stuff in rural areas.
Thank you. And I'll just start as I see them across the screen. Kathy Kelly, would you like to ask the question?
I wonder if you looked at all at historical issues like this, for example, the bringing of electricity and then telephone communication to rural areas. And if you did, whether there were any lessons to be learned there.
So one of the differences between particularly electricity and communications networks is that my understanding is that the electricity connections don't need to be maintained and updated as frequently as communications networks do. So that adds a whole additional cost to communications networks, which are evolving and changing day to day. And we've seen just in the last 10 years, moving from 3G to 4G to 5G, which are all very big steps up in the technology, whereas the electricity market doesn't quite have that same level. And you could also argue that based on what happened in Texas last year, where we saw kind of a complete energy market failure, maybe there should be more innovation. So that would be sort of an area that it shows where it can be helpful to have private companies maintaining them, so that they're always improving those networks.
Cora, yeah.
Sorry. First of all, thank you so much to both of you. This was a great presentation. I know nothing about this area of law, and Kelly, you did a great job explaining it. And I also just want to say, before I ask my question, that lots of people can produce excellent scholarship, and I think this sounds like an excellent piece of scholarship. But it's hard to do something that's also important to society, and this seems to hit on both. So I just want to applaud you for doing that, Kelly. So my question for you has to do with the definition of rural. And as I said, I don't know anything about this in your world, but in my field of criminal law, rural justice is really emerging as a big issue for many of similar reasons that you've described. What do you do when your small police force has to cover thousands of miles of area? Or what do you do when people can't get to court because there's no public transportation and so forth? And I think you mentioned in your talk that the FCC and was it T-Mobile had different definitions, or maybe it was one of the other companies. So I'm wondering how rural is defined. Is it population density, or what is it?
So the FCC, I believe, defines it by population density, but even within the commission, some bureaus and some proceedings at the commission will define rural by population, and others will define it by like geographic area. And that's something that happens at the commission too. And then the companies sort of can have their own definition. So there's not one working definition. And Mike, if you have anything to add there, but I do think that different areas in the commission define it differently by population or geographic area, because some proceedings, universal service proceedings, are done by population and some are done by geographic area. So there's not a unity there either.
And it seems like that would be low hanging fruit in terms of reform. Like, let's at least all be on the same page if we're measuring it by proximity to a city or population density or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so the broadband mapping should, in theory, improve on that too, that they're working on.
You would think that that would be the case, but as we're sitting here in January 2022, and we're still talking about the idea of a map to figure out where people do and do not have broadband, right? You hear that and it sort of boggles the mind. Like, how do we not know that at this point? And the FCC and Congress are spending tons of money to figure out just that. We've been giving out money for years based on maps that were submitted by carriers in a voluntary way. A lot of times what a carrier would do is sort of over amplify how much coverage it actually had, because carriers, if you did that, money wouldn't go into that particular area and you'd have one less competitor. So there's been a lot of anti-competitive reasons behind not having a sort of hard and fast definition of what that is. So again, it's sort of hard to believe that we're still talking about this and we still don't have these maps. We're hoping to get them at some point this year to know for sure where, okay, I'm in this spot. I don't have broadband, give us the money to try and build that. It's kind of nuts at this point.
Yeah, great, thank you.
And Professor Drinan, another example too of one of the ways that the carriers could get around this is they could build a tower in an area that's convenient for them, but that doesn't actually provide service to a person, and then claim that area as being covered. That's just an example of how they could get around that as well.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Heidi Schooner.
Kelly, thank you so much for this presentation. So interesting, and I know nothing about the field, and my comment is sort of similar to both Professor Kelly and Professor Drinan. In banking, there's a similar issues in providing deposit and credit services to rural areas. In banking, you're also dealing with, and probably this is true with criminal justice, you're also dealing with the problem of discrimination. Which is different because presumably when discrimination is the problem, you have the market, it's just that people don't want to serve it. Whereas the rural problem is different. The market doesn't exist. And that's why the private companies need incentives to go serve that, that market. But in banking, that debate has been going on for a long time since banks were created. But the most recent iteration of that is not the discriminatory problem, the more rural problem is to use the post office to provide banking services, because back in the day, you used to be able to use the post office to get money orders, et cetera. And the post office right now is doing a pilot program, which is very limited, and it's probably unfair to judge it because it's so limited. But it seems like that was the whole purpose of the post office in some ways, right? Is the post office, as it's currently structured, has to have offices in places where FedEx won't go, UPS won't go, et cetera. So it just seems to me with this broadband question, the problem is that the free market doesn't work well when there's no market. So it's in some ways surprising to me that we're relying on private companies to provide that broadband in places where they can't make money. It just seems to me to be a place where a government-sponsored entity could be the solution. And maybe that government-sponsored entity only provides 4G, but the government gets some recoupment of its expenses by charging for it, like the post office does. I think the problem with the post office is we expect the post office to be profit-making, and it just can't be because it has to serve those markets where there isn't a market to support the need. But I just wonder if anyone in this field has ever considered a public-private solution as opposed to trying to provide these carrots to the private companies. If
Professor,
that's
you
ever
just
been
opened a big
discussed.
can of worms, Professor.
That's what professors do.
Yes, so basically the infrastructure bill does talk about government-owned networks, I believe. So the infrastructure bill wants it to look more like that, which is interesting, but it's still relying on private companies to build those networks, from my understanding. And during the Trump administration, former President Trump basically released this statement saying, we're going to build a government-owned 5G network. And it caused all of this uproar in the industry. And essentially what I think the industry's response was we've been trying to do this for years and years and years, and we can't get it right. So how is the government going to get it right, basically? And because the technology changes so much, and because there's all of this historical infrastructure in place that we're still relying on. So even when we're building 5G technology, a lot of times the small cells that Mike mentioned being built in different regions are building on existing network technology. And so having a completely government-owned network just wouldn't really be possible because of how the infrastructure is set up today and how we're always building on these historical constructions. So it's difficult, and it probably won't ever be possible to have an entirely government-owned network, even in a rural area.
There's been a lot of discussion about public-private partnerships at the municipality level over the last 5 years. We've seen some of those partnerships. There's been litigation over those types of partnerships, about a municipality being involved in both the construction and ownership of a network. Those haven't always been particularly successful. And I think there's been a bit of a de-emphasis on that. And Kelly's right, there was this sort of idea that was being floated by the Trump administration of a nationalization of wireless networks in this company behind the idea of they'll be more secure. It was really based more on security rather than building out to all rural areas. And there was quite a backlash against that from a lot of market-based folks, and obviously all the private entities who have been doing this. The post office example is actually a pretty interesting one, because I believe if you go back to the origins of the post office, part of the idea was you would have telecommunications hooked up in each post office. And I wouldn't be surprised if within the next couple of years, you see every post office in the country try and secure money to be essentially a broadband hub, a place where you can put this type of infrastructure and expand it, since you already have those types of entities in rural areas. I think that's probably likely to happen at some point.
And that would be similar to Comcast's Internet Essentials program that they have, which they also have Wi-Fi hotspots that are available to people, and they made them free during the pandemic too, as I mentioned.
So would the post office become an internet cafe? Is that what you're basically saying?
It'd be like Chase
Yeah,
Bank. It'd be like Chase Bank. You'd go in, you do your banking, and you'd hang out and sip coffee for an hour.
Coffee too. Okay, Stuart next. In the interest of time, we'll have Stuart and then Sanford Williams, and we only got like 6 minutes left. Try to get out at 12. So Stuart and then Sanford, and that will be it, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Kelly. That was excellent. I'm just wondering, do any other countries handle this better? Or are there any examples from other countries that we could use here?
Well, China is pretty much state controlled, so and their government funds, basically private companies in the US have to pay. Private companies just paid $80 billion in the most recent spectrum auction for access to 5G spectrum. So in China, those costs don't exist. So they've been able to build 5G networks at a faster rate than we have. And I don't know as much about the European market, but European markets tend to have, they also use, I won't get into, well, they use Chinese manufactured components in their networks at a higher rate than we are in some cases, is my understanding, and those can be cheaper. So that might allow them to build out faster. But yes, the primary example would be China is sort of looking at providers who don't have to pay some of the network costs that providers in the US do.
And part of the problem is our geography in the United States. I represent a carrier in Alaska, for instance. Building out broadband in Alaska is extraordinarily difficult. So sometimes you'll look at numbers about percentage of people covered, and you'll look at a country like South Korea, and you'd be like, well, why, how, we should be more advanced. How come they've covered more people? Well, it's a much smaller country that doesn't have to worry about the topography that we have in a lot of areas, both in the Western United States and Alaska.
And some of those networks too were built later on. So they were started from maybe an easier position, whereas some of the networks in the US are very piecemeal. Whereas some of the networks in countries like Mike mentioned, South Korea, Japan also comes to mind. They were built later with newer technology, making it a little bit less piecemeal than what we currently have in the US.
Okay, and Sanford, we'll turn it over to you and then we'll finish.
Okay, I'll be quick. First, I want to let Kelly know it was a wonderful presentation. I'm here attending as a friend, but I'm also the Deputy Director of the FCC and a Special Advisor to Chairwoman Rosen Worcel. And the discussion has cogently captured a lot of the issues that we deal with. I wish I could just take everything you said and share it with Chairwoman Rosen Worcel. But great job, Kelly, and great discussion. So thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thanks so much, Sanford. Means a lot.
Thank you for joining us too. Thank you all for coming today. I think it's many of these things educate us all, but this one is this is something I think many of us are learned a great deal today. And Kelly and Michael, I think it's an important work, and I hope we'll help you pursue it. And thank you all for coming. We'll do this again next month. Look for the Zoom invitation, and thank you again. Goodbye.
Thanks, Kelly. Great job.
Thank you, everyone.